Hey everyone, welcome to the most opinionated space podcast on the internet,
Ad Astra, the podcast where we integrate space, policy, and technology.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Newton.
I have a Master's of Public Policy degree with concentration in science and space policy.
And I'm a PhD in computer science and an all-around tech geek.
All right, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at @AdAstra_podcast, like us on Facebook, and subscribe to our mailing list on elemental.fm to get regular updates from the team. And if you like what you hear, give us a 5-star review on iTunes and recommend us on Overcast.
Okay, and today we are very happy to have special guest comedian Rubi Nicholas on the podcast. Ruby, how are you?
I'm great. How are you guys?
We're great.
Doing well.
It's great to see you. Ruby is a comedian in the Lancaster, Pennsylvania area and performs everywhere from Toronto to New York to DC. Ruby, how about telling the listeners a little bit about yourself?
So I am a stand-up comedian, but I also have a science background. I have a pure MS in occupational therapy with a geriatric focus, and I was raised by Pakistani people who are also natural scientists, it turns out. My dad's a doctor, and I have always had a huge affinity for science and all things that I can break down into simple experiments and say, well, that didn't work out. And I use it in my comedy all of the days. So I'm super pumped to be here. Thanks so much for having me on, guys.
Yeah, we're happy to have you on. So you use some science in your comedy. Tell us a little bit about sort of what impact do you think science has played in your career?
One of the things I think is interesting is people always think of comedy as either a non-art where, oh, that's not an art. Or, those who really embrace it as an art form go, well, how is it an art form? And I personally feel, having been raised by super concrete, sciencey people, that it was really nice for me to be able to have an outlet that was non-binary in any way. There's no measurement whatsoever to the satisfaction that I get from talking about how anal retentive my parents are on stage. It is an amazing feeling, and it's incredibly transformative, which for me is what makes it art. What's amazing is that when I first started comedy, I learned about the science of comedy and how incredibly analytical comics can be. And I love that because I myself am sort of analytical. And it's one of those things where I have a career, I have a day job, I have a life, and no hobby has ever stuck for more than maybe 2 years, right? Like I can geek out on something and take a real deep dive for a couple of years as a hobby. But comedy sort of became my jam because it is constantly evolving. It's constantly great. And when I first learned about it, I thought, oh my gosh, you guys practice this? You're thinking about this before you get on stage? Like I literally thought stand-up comedy was stand up and be the most hilarious person. I had no idea.
That's how most people see it.
Exactly. Yeah. We measure things like LPMs, laughs per minute, how many laughs per minute, how many seconds to the first laugh, how engaged is your audience is based on what the reactions look like. We read body language. We read all kinds of nonverbal communication from our audiences and actually track that. And so for me, science is actually tracking and then developing a system based on those sort of gathered data points that say when 17 members of an audience are folding their arms, your joke is sucking. Like those are the kinds of things that I love. Laughs per minute becomes super important. How many laughs, how many jokes, how many taglines can you get out of it? There's jargon. Like every good scientist in their field worth his salt loves his jargon, right? So I love my jargon. So punchlines, taglines, callbacks, all of those things are things I didn't know until I became a stand-up comedian and I started practicing the art of stand-up comedy and the science of stand-up comedy. And I just fell in love because it's both. It's a pure art and a pure science.
That's interesting. So you're up there taking measurements and things like that, or I mean, do you like watch some of like the recordings?
Oh,
of
absolutely.
Your comedy and stuff like that. And
absolutely.
Get a sense of the audience.
Yep.
Things like that.
Every single in the beginning, when you're first learning the ropes, they give you, if you're lucky, 2 minutes of stage time. 2 minutes to make people laugh. I mean, in lay people terms, you're like 2 minutes. That's nothing.
Not a lot of time.
That's easy.
That's easy. But 2 minutes, if you are just absolutely not getting any laughs at all, and there's nothing but crickets, it's an eternity if you're trying to be a comedian. And my first laugh for me is 6 seconds into my set. So I have that absolutely timed out. And we do practice, and it is very carefully chosen. The words are carefully chosen. all of those things. So there is it's very much an art and a science. And that's why I think it appeals to me so much.
Well, that's awesome, and like I said, we're happy to have you on. So we actually brought Ruby on to talk about a few news headlines that have been sort of making their way through the space community and into the public, out to the general public. One of these articles was about the use of natural language processing for robot assistance. So sort of right up Ruby's alley. Now, natural language processing, for folks who are unfamiliar with it, it's a field of computer science, or more specifically AI, artificial intelligence, that's concerned with being able to analyze and understand meaning from human language, get concrete meaning from human language, and represent that as information. It's also concerned with doing things the other way around, being able to take data and information that's understood solely by a computer and outputting it, either in written words or as audible words in natural human language. Specifically, the first article was talking about NASA working on natural language processing for their Robonaut 2. Now, the Robonaut 2 was built to help astronauts with physical tasks while they're at the ISS, at the International Space Station. And this thing's actually pretty cool. It's a robot with a humanoid frame, and it's designed to take over simple, repetitive, or especially dangerous tasks on places such as ISS, or further out. For instance, this might be something that would be used on a deep space gateway, something on a space station for people living out by the moon, things like that. So one of the big things that they actually talk about is the use of some of these kinds of technologies on the way to Mars, which is an even longer journey. For listeners who don't know, Mars is at least a 2 to 2.5 year journey. 6 months there, a year to wait for the orbits to realign, and then at least 6 months back. So we're looking at going to Mars in the 2030s, and it would be really helpful to have something like this on board for some of the day-to-day tasks and just to keep humans company. But as of yet, there isn't any sort of concrete plans for a specific robot assistant for the Mars mission. And that's because the mission was just made official about a month ago. So NASA's in sort of a requirements gathering phase for this mission. What I want to talk about today is what some of those requirements related to this kind of robot assistant would be, specifically when it comes to natural language. And when I was reading up on this, that's when I remembered hearing about a field of natural language understanding called computational humor. And put simply, computational humor is the notion of having machines both understand humor as well as being able to create humor. Okay, so there's an entire research literature out there about algorithms for things like joke recognition using machine learning, and things like pun generation for making simple conversation, and algorithms for things like identifying funny pictures, things like that. And that has a role to play on a Mars mission. And one of the things that I wanted to chat about with you today, Ruby, was what kind of things would a robot like this have to look for in terms of things like reading the room with comedy, being creative, that sort of thing. Like,
I think one of the things that's interesting that comedians do sort of innately is reading body language. And I think what would be amazing for some of these, the robots that are interpreting human behavior, would be to actually feed them some sort of physiological data about their subject. Because, we all know that you can have a poker face, right? Like, I could walk into a room and be like, oh my God, you guys, my dog died. I got to go home sick today. Like, we all have our version of what our poker face is. But the reality is our biomechanics, our physicality will actually give away what our true emotion is in a given situation. So in my head, I would think that, anyone who's traveling for any length of time on a space mission specifically would have, lots of things hooked up to them. Like, what is their heart rate currently? If that heart rate monitor is always available. If they're, if I had my druthers as a comedian, I would say there should be a butthole tightening monitor where, the minute you say something, if you feel someone's butthole get tight, you go, okay. Because as a comedian, I watch people and I'll see people cross and uncross their legs in a seat and I'll go, okay. Some buttholes are tightened. I hit a parasympathetic nervous system somewhere. People are feeling a certain way about this topic, right? Because I talk about things like, certainly as a Pakistani Muslim and as a female, I talk about topics that are incredibly touchy to people, particularly in like rural parts of America where I get people that come up to me and say, I had never met one of you before, so that always makes my life interesting. And, to hear people like, I never thought you people had a sense of humor, which is, completely fair if you're only watching clips from the media and Fox News and everything else. The only things you're going to see is my people blowing shit up, you're not going to see, you're not going to see four random people just hanging around playing a game of cards, giggling and laughing about stupid stuff, right? Which is how I grew up. So from a cultural perspective, I think that it would be interesting to see how computational humor would impact robots in their actual valid interpretation of what this human behavior represents. So if someone is politely laughing at you, will that robot interpret that accurately as, this is polite laughter, I should say something even funnier to get to this woman, right?
I see.
Or this is laughter, I accomplished my goal, right? So, and I think that's sort of the long and historic disconnect of, non-sentient versus sentient beings in all of, sci-fi. So,
or maybe something like, this is, this is uncomfortable laughter. Maybe I should pull back.
Exactly.
Right?
Maybe the timing on this joke isn't exactly what the algorithm is saying.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't want a robot joking about, an astronaut who just passed away on the way to Mars.
Sure, 6 hours ago.
Or even worse, there's, an emergency going on and they ask the computer to do something. It says, I'm sorry, Dave, I cannot help you with that. Like, you don't want that to happen.
I was practicing sarcasm. Yeah, exactly. So it's going to be really interesting to understand how, not only natural language, but certainly those elements of natural language that are humorous in nature, sarcasm being one of them. I think that's a great version of humor that is difficult to explain to a non-human entity, in my estimation. If there's a way to catalog and physiologically describe through, again, breathing pattern, heart rate, temperature, butthole tightness, some real physiological patterns that say, hey, this person is being sarcastic and or this person is laughing, but they are angry. They are uncomfortable with you right now. Those would be interesting things for an actual robot to learn or a computer to learn through programming.
Yeah, the machine learning world is filled with different ways to sort of learn through examples, and the more data that it has, the better it can be sometimes in terms of learning through examples. So like you said, it could pull in a ton of different types of sensor data and, figure out when people are laughing, learn from the humans, look at them telling jokes back and forth, detecting when they're telling jokes and then, simulating that. So it's sort of like mimicking human behavior and mimicking human jokes.
Right.
Might be something for the astronauts just to have a little bit of fun with on the way to Mars. And like we said, if things start to get a bit too serious, that's the time when it needs to realize that it needs to, pull back, maybe dial it back and read the room a little bit. Even humans
humor sensors turned off. Or, whatever it is.
I know a lot of people in my field who even have trouble figuring that out. But
well, yeah. So that's the thing is you're going to be putting this thing in a tin capsule with 6 people who may or may not have really good social skills. So like, how is the computer going to be able to differentiate between someone who's introverted and doesn't, is kind of insecure about X thing, and then the computer makes a joke about it and everybody laughs, and suddenly you have an astronaut that's pissed off at everybody else.
Right.
So, I mean, this is maybe something that kind of ties into a later article that we'll bring up. about sort of the psychological benefit of this camaraderie and being able to have something to help you process, like a computer to help you process the what's happening. I need, almost an unbiased view, as unbiased as a computer can be. I mean, that it's in the culture, that's humans do that innately. I mean, everyone here has seen The Martian, or seen any bit of media where a computer is on the spacecraft, or there's people on the spacecraft and there's humor. I mean, I can't think of a video game or a movie or anything that takes place in space that doesn't have a little bit of humor in it, because that's just so innately human. And so then how does the computer, how is it able to adapt and sort of evolve with that humor and with the correct cultural context too? I mean,
that's true, because there's sort of a cultural and temporal aspect to jokes, right? Like jokes back in 2008 don't work. Not every joke from 2008 works today, right?
Sure.
Like there's a sense,
and there were comics called dated references, right? Like it's a dated reference. If you're telling a Lorena Bobbitt joke now, clearly you need to work on your material. That is extremely dated, right? And it's not as broadly appealing as a result of it being dated. It's played out. It's hack. It's over. We've already heard this 20 million times already. We don't want to hear another joke about, silly stuff, things that are so old, right? The Monica Lewinsky dress, things like that. So those I think are interesting. But what people find funny, and I think it's an interesting commentary that we talk about sort of how media and entertainment view the robot interpretation of humor, right? How it's always out there in sci-fi. But I think what the interesting thing is that there's a very common theme of the robot not understanding how to appropriately place humor, and the humans finding great humor in that. Yeah. I think the humans finding great humor in not knowing when to place, I was being sarcastic or whatever that is. And I'm sure there are a million specific examples, but
C3PO,
C3PO is a great one.
K2SO now.
Mr. Data from TNG. I mean, there's just a million different ways that these sort of, android beings have been struggling with their humanity, and the very place where the rubber hits the road is humor. It's probably one of the most complicated emotions or sort of human characteristics to really nail down from an algorithmic scientific perspective. I think stand-up comics are a group of people that have come close, with all of this sort of data elements that we track. But
you're the subject matter experts on this.
On that, right? Because there's the reading the audience, and there's a way to bail out of a bad joke. And, we have all kinds of sort of tricks in our back pocket to say, like, oh gosh, I'm reading that you're not getting me. And here are my go-tos. Here are my different, sort of escape routes to get out of this place, to continue to do my job, because my job ultimately is to make you laugh so I get my check, right? I get paid to make you laugh. So how do I do that? And then that becomes sort of a bunch of tricky experiments along the way. And for a robot, I think it's interesting because the way stand-up comedians do it is I will tell that joke 100 times for free at an open mic or on stage somewhere in Philly before I'll actually roll it out on stage during a paid set, because I need to know that it actually works. And what might work one night, in Baltimore might not work another night in Plainfield, Connecticut. And so for all of them to work, I need to know that they work numerous times with a number of different people.
So given that this is the same crowd, then, it's going to be the same 6 or 8 or 10 people on the way to Mars. Yeah. I mean, do you think that at least makes the mission a bit more, or the feasibility of having legitimate humor, acknowledged and given by a robot a little bit more feasible, a little bit more tractable?
I do. I think it has a lot more tractability, because specifically when you define an audience by their value system, their overarching bent in terms of these people like sarcasm, then you sort of go there with them, right? Like you'll hear comics say, you guys want to get dirty. Let's get dirty in live shows all the time. The comic that floats one dirty joke out there and then the audience just goes ballistic and loves it. Well, that comic, to do his job, which is make the audience laugh, right, is going to go right down that road again. So in the algorithm where a single non-human being or the robot being is in intimate contact with a limited number of people, I could see that there would be a long-term sort of artificial intelligence development of humor, and that humor would be very, very unique to that group. You know, like the inside jokes and the callbacks and sort of what comedians call callbacks, right? You say a joke and a punchline in the middle of your set. At the end of the set, you talk about the same thing, like, that's my piece of chicken. But at the end of the Chris Rock set, it's called a callback. So those things will become inherent. And it'd be interesting because they could develop sort of their own comedy sub-language if humor is considered an elemental component of, you know, how these robots communicate with humans.
That's really interesting. So Mars may be this field's best chance at a real experiment and, you know, building up and actually, you know, building up real algorithms and programs in this space. Very cool.
Right.
Very cool.
Very cool.
And especially with multiple missions to Mars, and if these missions are international, I mean, this takes it to a whole other plane.
Right. Yeah. Alexa and Google Home are going to look like nothing compared to this. So.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially when you consider the cultural differences of what people find humorous, you know?
Right. That we're going to have some serious experiments, not just with you know, going to Mars and the science that we're going to be conducting on our way to Mars, but with the humans that we're sending there. They're effectively a part of this experiment too. And that actually is a great chance for us to move on to our next topic,
the high seas mission.
The high seas mission. So moving from humans communicating with robots to humans communicating with other humans. So recently, last month, NASA's high seas mission just hit a midway point. The NASA-funded mission is a behavioral study out of the University of Hawaii. And basically, this is 6 people living alone on a volcano in Hawaii for about 8 months. So they just hit the 4-month mark last month. The mission is to simulate life on Mars, forcing those astronauts to live in very harsh conditions, isolated in an environment that's similar to what they would experience, to what you would experience on Mars. And the objective of the study is just to observe and study the team's dynamics, the interpersonal communication, the stressors, things like that. And that's going to help inform NASA as far as selecting astronauts for future long duration space travel, like on Mars. And this is something that's actually, it's actually really cool. New York Times has been documenting sort of an episodic series about these folks living together and executing like Mars missions together and looking at the team dynamics. So there's already effectively a Mars reality show, just here on Earth.
That's amazing.
Yeah. It's really cool. This program is actually underneath another program called Ad Astra. Funny enough.
Oh, nice.
Which
we have no affiliation really with this.
No
program.
relations. So Ad Astra stands for Automated Detection of Attitudes and States through Transaction Recording Analysis. And basically it's a constant monitoring program. It's just it's a huge Big Brother program where they record all of the interactions, all of everything that the crew is doing. Whenever the crew is inside this dome in Hawaii, they're monitored on video by remote researchers from places like University of South Florida and a bunch of different universities. And basically, these are behavioral psychologists just monitoring this group of people's behavior. So, as far as high stress environments, how do you get the right kind of people with the right combination of people skills and mission readiness, and even relating it back to humor, how do you get people who, have the ability to use humor to calm people down and de-stress? How have you used humor to calm people down and de-stress, Ruby?
Right. So I think it's a very interesting situation where they're actually just using, I hope, and again, and this might just be me, the cynic, saying like, what do you mean? They're just watching what they say and do? That's not how they really feel. There should be scientific data points. They should be gathering physiological evidence. Like, if I'm saying the words to you, it's okay, that doesn't bother me, but my heart rate's 144 a minute.
And your bundle is X inches tight. Yeah.
Exactly right. If I'm ready to fight the bear in the woods, I'm not okay. Like there's something triggering that is significant here, and it needs to be addressed because week 1, I might look great and be really okay with this. Week 2, I might be really okay. Talk to me around month 9 and I might want to punch you in the face over how you breathe, So I think those are really important distinctions to make, is that there's behavior and tolerance over a limited period of time versus what you're able to tolerate over an extended period of time. And I think what comedians do best is sort of the psychology of sublimation. And, 100 years ago, Freud talked about sublimation as a defense mechanism, as the highest form of defense mechanism, where you take a painful experience and transform it, process it. I mean, again, it's defense mechanism. Others would argue in the sort of neo-Freudian era and in the Ericksonian sort of schools that psychology is about transforming the energy from pain to humor. And that's what sublimation is. But ultimately, the use of humor then can take something incredibly painful. I mean, you'll hear comedians talk about everything from incest to, being the child of rape to just crazy stuff on stage, and finding a way to create a relationship or relational analogy to other sort of broad-based, middle of the bell curve human beings that's relatable, because when you boil it all down, we're all made of these basic emotions, right? Fear, anxiety, love, anger, sadness, all of those things. And those are the things that I think comedians are very, very clear about, is that we all have these emotions. It's almost like comedians are the new sophists, right? The new philosophers and the new sophists that just sort of say like, okay, we're all made up of this stuff. If I turn this knob, what stuff of you is going to come out, right? Like, is it going to be humor or is it going to be pain? Is it going to be laughter? Is it going to be tears? And so much of what comedians do is that sort of transformative attempt at, this is hard. I want to feel better about it. This makes me hurt. I want to not hurt. And the healing that I think is forthcoming from being able to sublimate those negative, whether emotions or even health statuses. I mean, you look at some of the medical research that's being done on people with an optimistic vibe versus, someone who's just sort of really accepting of their death. Some of the breast cancer research said that denial was a better predictor of longevity than people who accepted their disease. So these are really interesting comments on, how much human emotion, air quotes, do we really need to take in as pain, and how much of that pain can we then subvert or convert somehow into a lighter, more optimistic tone, because it's better for you, right? Like, you don't want catecholamines. You want serotonin levels to be higher. You want things to be soothing, and particularly if you're going to be in space. I mean, particularly if you're going to be stuck somewhere, you really don't want to be angry the entire time,
So it's clear. It's clear to see that, like, it's clear to see stand-up comedians typically are converting pain into comedy, but how do you pull that sort of into your conversations? I've talked to you, Ruby. You're funny in conversation. What are you typically thinking about in that case? Is it still more of the same? Is it still just kind of
sort of that pervasive anxiety that I live with on a day-to-day basis? Thanks. I'm glad we're friends, Newton. Thanks for calling that right out. That's amazing. No, you know what? It's not just a stage thing. She does it all the time. She's always anxious.
I've talked to multiple comedians.
And I really just need your acceptance, no matter who you are. Street person, man on the bus, friend of mine. I think that's part of it. I think part of what comedians do, I think as a matter of course on stage, as a matter of our art and the way it's expected to be presented is to provide people with an opportunity to say, hey, here's a look in my life. Here's some human emotion. I'm going to laugh at this. I'm sure you felt a similar emotion that was, despair or shock or absolute, apathy or whatever the situation was in that way. And the analogous feeling that you should now feel is humor and laughter and joy, because that's the feeling that I feel now about same said given situation. I think in daily life, the way that works is very, very similar, right? And one of the things that I think would be vital, truly in the absolute definition of the word vital, for these folks that are traveling together, that are going to be together for long periods of time, is the ability to relate to one another as human beings in a completely humble fashion and say, I experience pain, loss, fear, anxiety, heartbreak, joy, ecstasy. All of those things are things that I experience as a human.
Oh, these people are going to get to know each other better than anybody
I like
else.
to share that with you, right? And if they can share that, from a place that's not always serious or always emotionally burdened or always emotionally deep. And honestly, that's one of the things that I think, when they're doing these sort of 6 month or 6 week or 10 month, whatever it is, leave society, be with these 8 people, can you hack it journeys. When they do those, can you hack it camps, they really need to think about how well they do. Each individual needs to think about how well he or she does with being relatable as an individual. Because I do think that the scientific community specifically suffers from that horrible sort of reputation, stereotypically, that you guys don't even talk. I don't even understand what you're saying. You're just
like everyone's robotic and everyone's
you're just looking at me like I'm an experiment. Just say something,
I mean, we're literally running experiments on people. That's the whole point of this thing.
Exactly right. We're all looking at you through the looking glass,
Right. So and they have a series of these different types of programs, and this research is getting a bit more prevalent. There's like the HERA program over in Arizona where they're doing I think they had 8 people on that one, just alone in Arizona in the middle of the desert. They had another one out in Antarctica. So these things are getting more and more prevalent, and it's got to be the right what it's going to take to get us to Mars is the right combination of people with the quote unquote right stuff. If you guys remember the right stuff from the Apollo days,
it sounds so much like the white stuff. I'm sorry.
I know.
Keep going.
That's really what it was. People with the right stuff, and a series of mechanisms for de-stressing and just relaxing. So here's a question for you. What do you think the ideal times are to pull comedy into a situation that's becoming high stress? Let's say you're on the way to Mars. Alarms start going off. Where do you start to pull some humor into that situation in order to
when you know you're gonna die? That's when you want to start dropping the mad punchlines. That's like you just want to throw everything out there and be like, "Hey guys, one thing I was thinking about that one time."
So when chance of survival goes below like 20%,
absolutely,
that's
when death is imminent, that's hilarious. There is nothing that should hold you back in that moment from telling all your best jokes.
Yeah.
I do think that in a stressful situation, if operations are handled right, I do believe that that's the right place. It's certainly not when you're at at some sort of critical point in terms of decision making, right? If they're like, we should cut the red wire or the blue wire, and you don't want that person being like, hey, what if we cut all the wires and just call it a day? That's not it's not the time, right? That's that sort of time and place component of humor that becomes very interesting when you think about that in an android world, in a non-human world where we have so many variable dependent and independent control items that are like taking place in our like experiment of what's funny and what's not funny, you know? I mean, what makes one person's skin crawl is making another guy bust a gut in the same room. And we're all human, you know? So that becomes really interesting. And I think that, you know, these 8 people are hopefully that intimate that when crisis hits, they're able to resolve it in a quick, sort of painless, operational, you do this, I do this. And the instant it's over, the addition of humor, you know, sort of dispels all of that stress. And you sort of add that relief to like, you know, well, we're not dead. Hallelujah. Yep. You know, like who prayed? Did someone pray? Did someone pray? Because I feel like Jesus had something to do with that one. You know, like just kind of something to diffuse the situation. And I think that sort of brings everyone kind of on the same page. And by the same token, I think the one thing that humor does in a situation where crisis has been avoided, where crisis has been specifically avoided, and this comment sort of comes from my work, working in end-of-life care and working in healthcare for many, many years, is that when crisis is avoided and you can laugh, part of what I think healthcare employees do specifically and people at end-of-life do is we're able to then avoid having to process all of the emotion that came with that death. Because when it goes well and you can, you know, put a timestamp on it and say, patient ceased to breathe at X time, and we can all walk away feeling like everyone did their job. And someone makes a little joke like, cool, it's not even lunchtime yet, or something silly. You know, we can package that and put it away without necessarily processing that emotionally, which sounds difficult and disturbing to a lot of people who don't work in that field.
But if you're doing it,
but when you consider, if you're someone who's dealing with 6 or 7 deaths a day, and the human emotion that's revolved around, you know, this person's dying, but then their children are present and their parents may or may not be present, and their, you know, spouses and ex people. And, you know, that's a lot of human emotion to have to process. So the ability to compartmentalize that and sort of not deal with it is a fine line in healthcare, right? Because then you could end up on the other side where you stop caring, right? Your moral compass, that, you know, true north becomes watery, and then it becomes an invisible line, and then people make huge mistakes. So, you know, it's all a careful dance. That's what makes us human versus not, you know?
I've actually heard like something similar from folks who work in like emergency rooms and in critical surgery. You know, so that's definitely interesting. And
well, I think going back to the point you made earlier, Ruby, with Freud, like it's one of the best coping mechanisms. It's the best way that you can sort of take a very complex situation that probably has, you know, a dozen different emotions running through you, and you're able to separate them and compartmentalize them and say, okay, like this is why I'm feeling X, Y, and Z because ABC. You know, that's where I guess the science part of it comes in, is being able to methodically do that over and over and transmit that process to a robot and then implant humor into it at a certain point.
Right. I mean, it becomes incredibly complicated. Yeah.
I sort of dumbed it down a little bit for myself, but for, I mean, like that's, I guess the gist of it, right? Is being able to take these observable instances where, you know, ABC happens, XYZ is the result. And, you know, 9 out of 10 times someone made a joke. Okay, well, the computer knows, okay, 9 out of 10 times people are going to expect a joke after that. So 90% of the time, a joke is going to come out.
And it will be received as appropriate. Right. And it will be received as appropriate, right?
Yeah.
Until that, you know, the 10% of the time when too soon. Too soon, robot.
Exactly.
Too soon.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, this once again, and Jack, you and I have talked about this on previous podcasts. This just gives you a sense of Mars once again being the hardest thing that we've ever done.
Well,
because you have to think about
There's also just the fact that, like, I'm looking at some of the names of the people who are doing the high seas in the HARO program, and none of them are astronauts. We haven't done this with astronauts yet.
Right.
Like that's a whole other group of people who have gone under almost an insane amount of stress and rigor and studies to get to where they were. Not to demote the people who are already doing the high season HARO program. But the astronauts, that's a whole different set of people, and they could have a completely different, warped sense of humor. I mean, all the Air Force pilots that became astronauts, during the Cold War, I'm sure had really, really dark senses of humor for various reasons.
Yeah.
Do we have the same thing going on now? And would it be appropriate then to continuously model our, humor 1.0, whatever the robot whatever the program ends up being called, like keep modeling that over so many years with the same group of people? Is it going to get better, or is it a program that's going to have to be able to evolve with different groups of people, which I'd argue for the latter. I mean, you're not just going to have one mission to Mars, knock on wood. Theoretically, there's going to be 6 people on the ground, and then there's going to be 12 people that have been to Mars, and then, 18, and it's just going to continuously grow. And you're going to need a program that's able to sort of evolve with the astronaut corps.
Well, not to open up a can of worms here, but
hey, we do that all the time on this podcast. We're tangent central.
You do have the internet to mine. Looking at some of the newest and like latest jokes on the internet to like figure out what's currently trendy, what's currently funny, and attempt to produce things out of that as well. So,
and I think that's fair, but I also think that if people are with one another for an extended period of time and with a single piece of artificial intelligence that is developing an algorithm over time, right? So if it is self-adapting, like you would expect AI to do, like I would think that at the end of 6 months or a year, that robot would have a sense of humor that would only appeal to those 8 people.
Yeah.
That's literally what I would think. I would think that would not be a generalizable set of jokes or experiences, because that's how families are built, and that's what happens, right? So inside jokes are the best jokes. Right. Those are the best jokes. So when the robot or whatever, when the artificial intelligence being starts receiving, okay, so I'm thinking like a comedian, right? Like I'm like, dude, if everybody in the room is laughing when I say, "Remember Delta 6?" That's the best joke ever, right?
It's got 100% feedback.
But right, from a statistical perspective, I just became the best joke writer and joke teller on this ship. So it'll be interesting to see how, to Jack's point, how one would generalize those scripts or those pieces of humorous information to be able to use on mission 2, on mission 3, on mission 4. Or if, in fact, there would have to be unique scripts developed for each of those groups,
Yeah, and one last thing. This, looking at it the other way, because you are getting, with this sort of very specific group, and you're adapting to this very specific group, humor isn't the only thing that robot's obviously going to be analyzing. It's going to be, things like empathy within that group, figuring out what the individuals as well as the group truly cares about. And, I'm thinking about spin-off technology already past the 2030s. I mean, look at the potential use for something like that with, family care, end of life care, like you were talking about, sitting those things in old folks' homes or alongside people who are bedridden or injured, and having it sort of detect some of the things that they care about and give those people sort of a tool for interaction. past that point in the 2030s. I think that might be something where this technology can grow beyond just obviously the Mars mission and actually be useful to people.
Right. Well, well, obviously we look to NASA to serve as the baseline for like in 20 years, this is a technology the common man might have. Let's just put that aside. Not that we need it now. It's cool. There's not hundreds of people dying in nursing homes. Anyway, completely alone and isolated from the world with no technology whatsoever. I'll just leave that alone for you guys to work on.
There's that dark humor again.
but what's really interesting is that, like, so this is sort of the very initial conversation around caretakers of the future. And when you look at the sheer numbers, the fact that the greatest generation is still alive and on the planet, and several are, and there's a percentage of them that are incredibly healthy. You've got 97-year-old drivers out there. When you think about those statistics, and then look at Generation X, my generation specifically, we are so tiny. There are not enough of us to care for the greatest generation and the baby boomers aging combined. So there's just not enough people. There's no manpower. So if the expected age and life expectancy continues to rise the way it does, I mean, there's one thing, right? Like, oh, cool, life expectancy in America is up. But like the last 10 years are super sucky. And you need a lot of care. Just because you can stay alive, should you, is the overarching question. But beyond that, if you are alive, what kinds of technological supports are we going to need in terms of robotics and robots? I mean, I think that's kind of one of the things that the Mars companions could start to answer, because we don't have the physical manpower.
Right.
We just don't. And we don't have the value system to back it up, right? Like, so if we were in a country that didn't have the physical manpower but had the right value system, in the third world, there are no nursing homes. Why? Because your grandma lives at home. Period. End of story. Yeah. Like, there's just no other excuse for that. You take care of grandma.
Or if you're first generation.
Right. Same here. That's why I live in Pennsylvania. I should be back in Colorado. But it's the same thing, right? Like, it's just what you do. So, so what's going to be interesting is that if we continue to keep this model, the model comes first, right? If there's a model of aging in institutions, then the model has to be supported by some sort of artificial intelligence to keep these folks going, because actual intelligence, physical humans, there's not enough numbers for us to keep this model going.
Yeah.
And we have to find that, like, where is the hole that this, the Robonauts and the artificial intelligence is going to fill? I mean, this might answer the question, is there even, room, so to say, on the spacecraft for a seventh crew member,
right? Which
would be Robonaut. And then how do you, and especially for, the terrestrial applications here on Earth, how do you, use this as a way to, ease, end of life care, or just overall, like, improve life here on Earth? What is it going to look like? There's a reason why Robonaut kind of looks like a humanoid, because people relate to that better. But like, what is that effect going to have on psychology, on the craft, the psychology back here on Earth with the spinoffs? Right. Like, I'm sitting here with the Echo Dot in front of me, and it's, this little hockey puck looking thing. And it doesn't, when I'm conversing with it, it's not like I'm having a conversation, but I'm sure if this thing looked more humanoid, it would be a more realistic conversation. I mean, it's all about your sensory.
I was gonna say, or it might freak people out.
Or it might freak people out. I mean, like, it could go either way.
And it depends on, I guess, your level of familiarity and comfort and all of those things, right? Like, so for a lot of folks, I mean, I have patients that are 98 and have full-blown dementia, and the easiest way to calm them down is to hand them a heavy doll baby, a naked baby. Just hand them a baby. And they just hold the baby and rock back and forth, and they stop doing whatever craziness that they were into. I mean, and that craziness could be anywhere from, sitting on the floor and pooping, and or throwing said poop, and or eating said poop. So, there's all kinds of things that happen that we may or may not be able to account for. But the interesting thing is that it always comes from a place of human emotion. There's always some sort of root base feeling that's taking place coupled with a physiological response. And so that's always been my bent, like in terms of robotics, is that, you can't just take you can't take humans at face value. We've all been disappointed. We're all grown up people, right? We all know that there will come a time when someone will say to your face, I really like you, and not mean those words, right? So how do you account for that in terms of, you turn around and like, so my turnaround would be like, I really like you too, but what's wrong with me? And be able to interpret those things as, I'm in pain, not I'm okay, and I think that that's where the robotics sort of have to come in is to begin to develop that algorithm that is based in, we talked about facial recognition technology. Well, that's one, right? Like, so that's one biometric that can be used to determine your actual psychological state, right?
It's the easiest one for robots to capture or sensors to capture.
Sure. Yeah. And there's also, vocal tone, vocal rate. There's elevated, the higher pitched you get, the angrier you are. The thicker my accent gets, the angrier I am. There's like all kinds of different ways that people can pick up on that. But there's got to be, thousands and thousands of different independent variables that could be modified as a result, so. Yep.
And, that's why you fund this type of research.
And that's why it's the coolest research ever.
But anyway, all right, we've got to move on. We're almost at the hour mark here. So just one last quick story. We'll do a couple minutes on this. I wanted to talk about, since we're on this Mars theme, a new game that I saw recently from Paradox Interactive called Surviving Mars. And the whole idea behind this game is it challenges players to plan and build a functioning colony on Mars. And it's really focused on balancing basic survival needs with sanity and quality of life. So all of these things that we've kind of been talking about, right? Just dealing with, working on building, building, gardens and agriculture on Mars while being in this hostile environment, and actually having dialogue and conversation and humor with people. And the CEO of the company was quoted as saying, your colonists aren't just working to improve production. Like, that's not the point of the game. And they're not just struggling to survive. Their conflicts and their concerns are also a big part of this game. So, it lets you understand what your colonists are dealing with at an individual level and come up with creative plans for those needs, as you're working your way through the game. So it's interesting. People are actually thinking about this. It's hard to believe that some of this wasn't inspired by, things like Andy Weir's book / the movie The Martian, as well as all of the other talk about Mars and the psychology of Mars lately. So it's interesting seeing that people are actually just, that people are actually going after this. People are actually thinking about it. And it just reminds you that people up there that we're going to have to send up there are going to need a sense of humor. They're going to need personalities.
Without question. Right? Yeah.
And I can attest. So I'm a Paradox game junkie. I'm currently playing Stellaris, which is their latest iteration in their game series. And I'm very excited for the Surviving Mars game. Yeah. But I think maybe even video games, at least for our current culture, is a great way to sort of be able to process these very complex problems and be able to convey them to the general public in a very easy way. And like, you made mention of The Martian. But I mean, this goes back, over, 100 years of science fiction, thousands of books and TV shows and movies, feed into this sort of cultural expectation for space exploration, and then also feed into our understanding of what the problems are going to be. And as I guess science fiction develops and culture develops, we develop new problems that we have to fix or find solutions for. I mean, I'm sure they weren't talking about humor in space when they were developing the Apollo program, but I'm sure if Apollo was happening today, they would be. I mean, it's a product of the times, and we're so much more scientifically minded, I think, today than we were, 50 to 100 years ago, all influenced by that culture of the last 50 to 100 years to get to this point. So I think being able to manage these resources, this real-time strategy type game, will be very interesting. I'm sure I'll live stream myself playing it on the Ad Astra channel or something.
It is really cool. And I think one of the things that'll be interesting to note, and I talked to Newton about this a little bit too, is that, in the gaming culture, in the science community, everyone is, really on board with humor in terms of its healing capacity. And, humor in and of itself is like, oh, yay, if you can laugh at it, you can convert a painful situation. And I do agree that it is a huge component of being able to survive disastrous, cataclysmic, dysfunctional situations. What's interesting too, though, is that we can't discount that, the folks that believe in God, that are religious, have the same impact on their health through using prayer and religion and spiritual mechanisms. And that is another interesting thing to note for, anybody that's playing in those artificial intelligence realms, is that that's part of the mystique of being human, right? Like, we can believe in things that may or may not have any factual basis whatsoever, right? Like, that humor in and of itself is, I could make up a word and you guys could think it's hilarious, right?
Like truthiness.
Right?
Yeah.
And it makes absolutely no rhyme or reason. So in much the same way, the religion mythology is embraced by so many people as reality that it triggers actual physiological results. The release of serotonins, the reduction in catecholamines in your system. Like, these are known facts that people of faith, people who have a very strong background of faith and a very strong religious network, I mean, maybe not social, but still religious, who believe that it's out there for them, that belief in and of itself is curative. Right.
Well, it's the camaraderie that comes with that, right? You have a network of people surrounding you, so that's kind of what that's kind of what allows you to get through the day, so to speak, right?
Right. And some of it's just that pure belief in an alternate being that's caring for you, so I don't have to stress about it. So it's really the ability to lose the stress in a situation, whether it's by finding the humor in it, whether it's by giving it up to a higher power or another being. But it's really sort of that, letting go of those high stress, high cortisol building situations, whatever the mechanism, that brings a human being peace. If that makes sense.
No doubt. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Okay. Well, all right, guys. It's Ruby. It has been great having you on. You got anything coming up in Lancaster or New York or anywhere that
actually, I'm going to be in Baltimore, actually, right in your neck of the woods. I'm sorry I didn't tell you in advance. I'm going to be in Baltimore on June 30th at Zissimo's Bar at 34th-ish and Hamden at an 8 o'clock show called Prim and Proper. It's a bunch of ladies in stand-up comedy. And I'll be hosting said show. So hopefully we can hang out.
By, definitely.
Yeah, hopefully get a chance to hang out. And again, your
send
side.
Send that link to us too, and we'll put it in the show notes and share it on
and
the Facebook.
I think the last Wednesday of August, I'll be in Baltimore as well, kind of on your side of the world there. So
okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks.
Great. Well, it's been great having you on the show. This is great. This is insightful. It's been funny as well.
Hopefully.
glad you can add some humor to Ad Astra. So, Jack, you got anything else?
All right. Well, this is a very busy week here in Washington, or Covfefe Land, Covfefe, whatever, however it's supposed to be pronounced. I think we're going to be the last podcast that's going to be using this word. So, listeners, you will not have to listen to this word ever again. So latest from Covfefe Land is a lot going on Capitol Hill. So the first thing coming up, sort of piggybacking off a story from the last couple weeks, is Ted Cruz's rise in prominence in the space community, sort of calling for maybe not so far as to say a renegotiation of the Outer Space Treaty, but a clarification of some of those uncertainties, and he held a hearing to the Space Subcommittee talking about, what could we change? What are the things that we need to really wrap up about the Outer Space Treaty? And the article that we're going to link in the show notes, is titled "Companies' Lawyers Argue Against Changing Outer Space Treaty." So a group of lawyers from all across the country, and policymakers and executives at top aerospace companies came out and said, hey, Outer Space Treaty is great. It's vague. It's not inflicting on our ability to profit right now. There's no company in space making a profit from doing things in space. There are companies that get contracts to send things into space, but there's no commercial viability to space as it stands. So changing the Outer Space Treaty to, according to this group, would be dangerous to do it so early. I guess I will have to agree with the senator from Texas in saying that this will be an issue in the future, and that sort of ties into my next little bit of information. But that this will be an issue in the future, and that we need to sort of start thinking about what needs to change, maybe not going so far as to passing any legislation. In that vein, draft legislation came out in the House for a bill called the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act of 2017. I took a brief overview of this, and it basically it purports to say that this legislation is going to clear up some of those uncertainties around the Outer Space Treaty and commerce in space, but doesn't really go so far as to create any mechanisms to do so. It does create a new set of purposes for the administrator of NASA and other secretaries within the U.S. government to categorize commercial space ventures, to create a catalog of objects in space, and make sure that there is a competitive market going into space, that we're not just going into the ether and there's no money to be made. But every clause basically stops short of saying fully automated space capitalism, by saying so long as it doesn't interfere with the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. So this is sort of these last two bits of information sort of in this commercial space area. We're trying to clear up some of these uncertainties without there really being a need to right now.
All right. Thanks, Ruby, so much for joining us on the show. This has been great. It's been hilarious, and we hope to have you on again.
Thanks so much for having me on, and I am pumped. Yeah, I can't wait to hang out and talk to you guys some more. Enjoy your lightning round.
All right. Sounds good. I'll see you.
All right.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, so lightning is going to be striking 3 times. I have 3 quick news items coming up in the next week on Wednesday and Thursday. So on Wednesday, there is the announcement of the new astronaut class. If anyone remembers, there were 18,000 applicants for the new group of astronauts to go through training. At 2 p.m. Eastern Time on NASA TV at Johnson Space Center, the vice president will be giving a talk or giving a speech introducing the new class. There is some rumor also that this is also where NSPOC, the National Space Council, is going to come to fruition, or at least the announcement thereof. On Thursday, we have 2 really big hearings, both on the House side. One of them is at 10 a.m. The witness is the acting administrator of NASA, Robert Lightfoot, giving an overview hearing of the NASA budget for fiscal year 2018 to the Science, Space, and Technology Subcommittee. The link to that's going to be in the show notes for the webcast. And finally, at 2 p.m. on the same day, on Thursday, there's going to be a budget hearing, again, for the NASA FY 2018 budget, with Acting Administrator Robert Lightfoot in front of the Committee on Appropriations Subcommittee, Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies, CJS, which controls all of NASA's budget.
So a lot of hearings going on.
Oh, yeah. There'll be a lot of listening.
Yeah. So are these are public hearings? People can sit in on them, or
yes,
are they closed door? Okay, great,
yes.
Great. Okay, so definitely take advantage of that if you can. Jack, you got anything else?
Nope, that is it. Make sure you tune in for those three things. The links are going to be in the show notes, and within those links are going to be the links to the webcasts.
Okay, great. Well, once again, it's been a great, very interesting episode of Ad Astra podcast. Hopefully we can have Ruby again. Shout out to Rubi Nicholas one more time. And Jack?
As always, I'm Jack.
I'm Newton.
Ad Astra.